Rosalie Ward pressed both hands flat against Eliza's chest and shoved her backward into the wooden post of the barn door so hard the whole frame shook. "Don't you dare walk out there," she hissed, her voice dropping low enough that their mother couldn't hear from the porch. "He came for me. Everyone knows he came for me. You go out there looking like that and you'll make us all a laughingstock." Eliza caught herself against the post, one hand gripping the rough wood, and said nothing. Her shoulder ached where it had struck. She'd been here before. Not this exact doorway, not this exact shove, but the shape of it was familiar the way winter was familiar. You knew it was coming. You just never quite got used to the cold. "He hasn't even seen you yet," Eliza said. "And he won't," Rosalie said. "Go muck the stalls. That's what you're good for, bum. If you've ever been the one in your own family that nobody thought was worth much, if you've ever worked your hands raw while someone else got the credit, got the dress, got the future, then stay with me. This story is for you. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that barn door in Montana, 1884, and watch what happens when the wrong woman gets chosen for all the right reasons. The Ward Ranch sat on 43 acres of hardpan Montana soil that looked, in late October, like the earth itself had given up. The grass had gone yellow and flat. The fence line sagged in 3 places that Eliza had been meaning to fix since August, but kept getting pulled away from by other, more urgent failures. The water trough that leaked, the roof on the south-facing shed, the aging mare who'd started favoring her left foreleg. Eliza had been up since before light that morning, same as every morning. She'd fed the horses, broken the skin of ice off the water barrel, checked on the 2 remaining milk cows, and eaten half a piece of cornbread standing over the stove because sitting down felt like a luxury she hadn't earned yet. By the time her mother came into the kitchen at 7:30, hair already pinned, face already arranged into the particular expression she wore when something important was expected of the day, Eliza had already put in 3 hours. "He's coming at noon," her mother said, without looking at her. "I need you to stay out of sight until we've had a chance to make introductions." Eliza set her empty mug on the counter. "I heard. Rosalie's wearing the blue dress." "I know, I ironed it." Her mother turned then and looked at her the way she sometimes did, not unkind exactly, but assessing, the way you'd look at a piece of furniture you weren't sure you had room for anymore. "You understand what this means for the family, Eliza. If Caleb Voss takes an interest in Rosalie, if he makes an offer, it changes everything for us. This ranch is 2 bad seasons from gone. You know that." "I know that," Eliza said. "I've known that for 2 years." Something flickered across her mother's face. Not guilt, more like acknowledgement without apology. "Then you understand why today has to go a certain way." Eliza picked up her work gloves from the hook by the door. "I'll stay out of the way," she said, and went back outside. She did not say what she was thinking. She had gotten good at that. What she was thinking was that she was 26 years old, and she had watched this ranch nearly kill itself for the last 4 years, and she was the reason it hadn't. Not her father, who had the vision without the endurance. Not her mother, who had the social ambition but no practical skill to back it. Not Rosalie, who at 22 was genuinely lovely and entirely useless in any situation that required something other than looking lovely. It was Eliza who had quietly renegotiated with the feed merchant after her father's handshake deal fell apart. It was Eliza who had figured out they could make up the shortfall on hay by cutting the herd to 12 and leasing the east pasture to the Kellerman family for grazing rights. It was Eliza who sat with the account ledger on Sunday evenings, when everyone else was at rest, moving numbers around with the grim focus of a woman who knows she is the only thing standing between her family and the kind of poverty that doesn't let you back up. She wasn't pretty, she knew it, and it had stopped bothering her the way it once had, when she was younger and still believed that bothering would change something. She was heavy-set in the way of women who do physical work in all weather, solid through the shoulders, strong in the forearms, with a face that was more honest than refined. There was a scar along her left jaw from a barbed wire incident when she was 19. Her hands were rough. Her brown hair was always either braided plain or stuffed under a hat. Rosalie, by contrast, looked like something out of a catalog. Their father called her his golden girl. Their mother called her an investment. Neither of them had ever said anything particular about Eliza except to tell her what needed doing next. By 11 o'clock, Eliza was mending the southwest fence line when she heard the riders coming up the road. She kept her head down and kept working. She heard the voices carry. Her mother's bright, performed welcome. Her father's careful heartiness. Rosalie's laugh, which was genuinely pretty, like the rest of her. She did not look up. She told herself she wasn't curious. She wasn't particularly about Caleb Voss, the man. She'd heard enough about him to form a rough picture. 32 years old. Controlled the largest cattle operation within 60 miles. His father, Gideon Voss, had built the empire and was now dying slowly in an upstairs room of a house that reportedly had 12 rooms, which Eliza found both impressive and vaguely obscene given the state of most homesteads in the territory. Caleb had a reputation for being direct to the point of rudeness and for having a good eye for cattle, which was the kind of compliment men in this part of Montana meant as the highest possible praise. He'd come looking for a wife. That part was being said openly. He needed a woman who could help him manage what his father had built, someone who could anchor the household side of a large operation. People assumed this meant he wanted something presentable, something that would reflect well. And so her mother had made her calculations, and Rosalie had been pressed into the blue dress, and Eliza had been quietly moved to the fence line. She didn't hear him approach. That was the first thing that surprised her. Most men on horseback give themselves away 20 seconds before they arrive. The creak of saddle leather, the huff of a horse catching its breath, the unconscious noise people make when they're moving through space and not trying to be quiet. But she didn't hear any of it. She heard a voice, low and even, about 8 feet to her left. That splice won't hold through a hard freeze. Eliza's hand stopped on the wire. She turned slowly. He was standing a few feet away, on foot, which explained why she hadn't heard him coming. His horse was back up the slope a ways, ground-hitched. He was looking at the section of fence she'd been working on, not at her. He was taller than she'd expected. Dark-haired, with the kind of weathered face that doesn't reveal age cleanly, but suggested a life conducted mostly outside. He wore a plain coat and working boots, nothing that announced money, though the horse up the hill was a good one. "I know," Eliza said. "I don't have the right gauge wire. This is a temporary fix until I can get to town." He looked at her then. Not the way men usually looked at her, which was briefly and then away. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the fence, assessing, specific, interested in what he was actually seeing rather than in what he'd expected to see. "Ward Ranch," he said. "Yes." "You're the older daughter." "Eliza," she said. "Yes." He nodded, once, like he was confirming something he'd already worked out. "Caleb Voss," he said, and offered his hand. She almost laughed because nobody had offered her a handshake in longer than she could remember. She shook it. His grip was firm and didn't perform itself. "Your family's up at the house," she said. "I know. I came out here first." He was still looking at the fence. "How long has this section been down?" "Off and on since July. I keep patching it. I need to replace about 30 feet of post and reset the line, but the timing hasn't worked." "Because you're doing everything else." She looked at him. "Excuse me?" "Your father. He have any injuries, or is it something else?" Eliza felt something go careful and still in her chest. "That's a personal question for someone I met 40 seconds ago." "It is," he agreed. He didn't apologize for asking it. "You don't have to answer." She studied him for a moment. He waited, which was also unexpected. Most men in her experience filled silences they hadn't caused. "He has good intentions," she said finally. "He always did. But the ranch needs more than good intentions, and I think he knows that now, even if he doesn't say it." Caleb Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The East Pasture. You're leasing that to the Kellerman family?" "For winter grazing. How do you know that?" "Lars Kellerman told me. Said it was the younger Ward daughter who worked out the arrangement." He paused. "Described you well enough that I knew you weren't in that house." Eliza said nothing. There was a roaring sort of feeling in her ears that she recognized dimly as the sensation of being seen by someone who was actually looking. "I should get back," she said. "My mother will want to do proper introductions." "I'll walk with you," he said. They walked up the slope together in silence that was not uncomfortable. When the house came into view, Eliza could see her mother on the porch, and she watched her mother's face go through 3 distinct phases in about 4 seconds. Confusion, then a terrible flicker of something panicked, then the reset into composed hostess. "Mr. Voss," her mother said, "I see you found your way around the property." "I was admiring the fence work," he said. Rosalie appeared in the doorway behind their mother. She was everything the blue dress promised, and she smiled at Caleb with the specific warmth of a woman who has been told her whole life that her smile is her best weapon. Caleb nodded at her politely. Then he looked back at Eliza. Her father came out from inside, and there were handshakes and the careful social choreography that her mother had clearly rehearsed. Eliza stood slightly apart. She was used to that. She watched Rosalie do everything right. The graceful way she offered tea, the pretty tilt of her head when she laughed, the strategic mention of her interests in a way that made her sound accomplished without seeming to try. Caleb Voss was courteous throughout. He drank his tea. He answered questions about his operation with the focused brevity of a man who finds talking about himself somewhat tedious. He looked at Rosalie when she spoke to him. He looked at Eliza more. It was Eliza's father who finally maneuvered the conversation to its point. Her father was not a stupid man. He was simply a man who had run out of the kind of luck that covers for strategy. "We understand," her father said, "that you're looking to establish a household, Mr. Voss, to find a suitable partner for for the responsibilities ahead." "That's right," Caleb said. "Rosalie has been well prepared," her mother began. "I'm sure she has," Caleb said. He set his cup down. He looked at it for a moment, then looked up and looked directly at Eliza. "I'd like to speak plainly, if everyone's agreeable." The room, which had been carefully warm and managed, went quietly tense. "Of course," her father said. "I've been asking around about this family for 3 weeks," Caleb said. "I talked to Lars Kellerman. I talked to your feed merchant, a man named August Pryor. I talked to the foreman you had 2 years ago, before you let him go. Sam Tillett." He paused. "Every one of them said the same thing, that this ranch is still running because of your older daughter, that she's the one who makes the decisions that matter, that she's the reason the operation hasn't folded." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room full of people who know something true is being said and are angry about it. Rosalie's face had gone very still. Her mother said carefully, "Eliza is certainly hard-working." "I'm not looking for hard-working as a polite description," Caleb said. He was not unkind about it. He was just precise. "I'm looking at losing my father before spring. I'm looking at inheriting an operation that takes 22 men to run, that has relationships in 6 counties, and that currently has 2 legal disputes I need to resolve before they become something worse. I need a partner who can think, who can manage complexity without losing her head, who has done hard things and kept going." He looked at Eliza. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider an arrangement," he said. "Formal, proper, with whatever time you need to think it over." Eliza was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually wasn't. She was aware of her mother to her left, so rigid she might have been carved. Of Rosalie across the room, whose expression had moved past still into something cold and sharp-edged. Of her father, whose face was doing something she'd never seen it do before, something that might have been shame, or might have been relief, or might have been both at once. She said, "You came here to meet Rosalie?" "I came here to meet the Ward family," he said. "I met who I came to find." Rosalie stood up. She did it with the careful control of a woman who has been trained not to make scenes, and then she looked at Eliza with a fury that was several years deep and said, very quietly, "Of course he wants you. You work like a man. Isn't that all you're good for?" She walked out of the room. Nobody went after her. Eliza's mother said, "Mr. Voss, I must apologize." "No need," he said. He was watching Eliza, who had not moved. "I imagine this isn't an easy afternoon for anyone in this room." Her father cleared his throat. Eliza. He said her name like a question, like he was asking her something he didn't have the words for yet. She turned and looked at him. This man who had never once said she was the reason they were still here. This man who had let her carry the weight of it, year after year, and said nothing except to point to the next thing that needed doing. She loved him. That was the complicated and frustrating truth of it. She loved him the way you love someone who has failed you so many times you've stopped expecting anything different, and still you can't quite close the door on them. "I need to think," she said. She went outside. The afternoon was cold and flat and smelled like coming snow. She stood at the corner of the barn, away from the windows, and breathed. Part of her wanted to say no. Not out of indifference to Caleb Voss, but because she had learned to be suspicious of anything that looked like rescue. In her experience, things that looked like rescue had a price attached that you didn't find out about until you were already in too deep to back out. And she had spent her whole life inside this family's version of that arrangement, working harder and harder for a recognition that kept getting given to someone else. She heard the door open and close behind her. She didn't turn around. "You don't have to decide today," Caleb said. "I know." He came to stand beside her, a few feet of distance between them, looking at the same flat view of dead grass and gray sky. "I want to be clear about what I'm asking. It isn't a simple life I'm offering. My father made enemies. There are people who will not be glad to see a new hand on the Voss operation. The work is real and the problems are real, and I'm not going to dress it up as something easier than it is." Eliza looked at him sideways. "Most men selling a situation try to make it sound better than it is." "Most men are selling something they're not sure about," he said. "I'm not. I know what I've got, and I know what it needs. I'm asking you because I think you know how to do things that matter, but I'd be a fool to pretend that makes it a bargain with no cost." She turned to look at him fully then. He met her eyes without flinching, without the performance of certainty that men sometimes put on when they want you to stop asking questions. "Why did you walk out to the fence first?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened exactly. More like it became more accurate. "Because I wanted to see what you'd do when nobody was watching to see if you'd impress me." She felt something move through her chest that she didn't quite have a name for. Not warmth, not yet. Something more cautious than that. Something that was beginning to consider the possibility that it had been wrong to write this off. She looked back out at the land. "I'll come see the operation," she said. "I'm not promising anything past that." "That's fair," he said. They stood there a moment longer, two people who were not yet anything to each other but might be in the cold October air, while inside the house her family tried to figure out how to rebuild an afternoon that had gone completely off its plan. Rosalie's voice came through the window, sharp and tearful. Their mother's voice came back, careful and managing. Her father's voice said nothing at all. Eliza pulled her coat closer and did not go back inside. Caleb Voss did not tell her to. That, she thought, was at least a beginning. She went back inside eventually because the cold got serious and because there was still supper to think about. And that was the kind of thing that didn't stop needing doing just because your life had tilted sideways on a Tuesday afternoon. Caleb Voss stayed for another hour. He sat at the kitchen table with her father and talked about cattle prices and winter feed costs with the focused patience of a man who understood that the social part of business was still part of the business. Her mother served more tea and kept her expression carefully pleasant and said nothing about what had happened in the sitting room. Rosalie did not come back downstairs. Eliza moved around the edges of all of it, doing the things that needed doing, listening without appearing to listen. When Caleb stood to leave, he shook her father's hand and thanked her mother for the hospitality. And then he looked across the room at Eliza and said, "I'll send word about when would suit for the visit. No pressure on timing." "All right," she said. Her father walked him out. When the door closed, her mother sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface and stared at them for a long moment. "Well," she said. Eliza didn't answer that. "He's serious," her mother said, not to anyone in particular. "I didn't expect him to be serious." "What did you expect?" Her mother looked up. "I expected him to want what men usually want when they come looking for a wife. Something that reflects well on them." Maybe he's not that kind of man. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your sister is upstairs crying." "I know. She's going to say things, Eliza. When she's hurt, she says things." "She already said things," Eliza said. "I'm not holding it against her." She picked up the empty teacups and carried them to the basin. "I'm not holding anything against anybody. I just need to think." The word from Caleb came 4 days later, a note carried by one of his hands, a young man named Dell, who had the manners of someone who'd been told to behave himself on this particular errand. The note was short. It named a date the following week and said a wagon would be sent if she needed it, and that he would understand if she changed her mind. She didn't change her mind. She packed a small bag and she went. The Voss operation was bigger than anything she'd let herself picture. She'd heard the numbers, 22 men, 6 counties, the largest cattle spread in that part of Montana, but numbers and reality are different things, and the reality of it hit her when the wagon crested the last rise before the property, and she saw it laid out below her in the gray November light. It wasn't just big. It was layered, complex, the kind of enterprise that had been built piece by piece over many years by someone who understood how power accumulates, slowly, quietly, and with a great deal of pressure applied in the right places. The main house was substantial without being showy. Long and low, built to withstand winter rather than to impress visitors. The outbuildings were well maintained, the fencing was tight and properly strung. The cattle she could see from the road were in good condition. She noticed all of this the way she noticed everything, cataloging, assessing, filing away. Caleb met her at the front of the house. He was in working clothes, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he dressed, and he had a smear of something on his left forearm that he either hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered about. "You came," he said. "I said I would." He showed her around the operation himself, which she hadn't expected. She'd assumed she'd get a foreman and a careful tour designed to impress. Instead, she got Caleb walking her through the actual working parts of the place. The stables, the supply room, the ledger system he used, the agreements he had with 2 separate beef buyers, and why he'd structured them differently. He talked to her like she was someone who could follow the specifics, which she could. She asked questions when she had them. He answered without simplifying. After 2 hours, they stopped at the fence on the north side of the property, where 3 of his hands were restringing a damaged section, and he said, "Ask me the thing you've been working up to." She looked at him. "What makes you think I've been working up to something?" "You've got a particular way of going quiet when you're deciding whether to say a thing." That landed more accurately than she was comfortable with. "Your father," she said. "How bad is it?" Caleb watched his men work for a moment. "Bad enough that the doctor doesn't give him spring. Might be wrong. Probably isn't." "And the legal disputes you mentioned?" "One of them is a boundary issue with a rancher named Cole Maynard. It's been simmering for 3 years. My father handled it badly. Started it badly, to be honest. And it's gotten worse. Maynard has real grievances." He paused. "The other one is more complicated, and I'd rather tell you about it inside where I can show you the paperwork." She noted that he said Maynard had real grievances. Not that Maynard was a nuisance, or an unreasonable man, or an enemy to be managed. Real grievances. "You're not like what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "A man who'd built something this big and thought that was the whole story." He looked at her briefly. "My father thought that. I spent a long time watching where it got him." They went inside. The interior of the house was functional and slightly bleak in the way of places managed by men without women for several years. Not dirty, but stripped of anything that wasn't strictly necessary. She sat at the kitchen table while he brought out a folder of papers, and they spent the better part of an hour going through the boundary dispute documentation together. She asked sharp questions. He gave straight answers. Twice she caught something in the paperwork that he hadn't flagged, and he looked at what she pointed to with a focus that was neither defensive nor dismissive, just genuinely working through it. She was starting to understand what he was actually asking her for, and it was more serious than she'd initially allowed herself to believe. The 3rd time she went quiet, he said, "Say it." She set down the paper she was holding. "If I come here, if I take this arrangement seriously, I'm not going to be a figure in the background. I'm not going to manage the household and smile at your business partners and stay out of the decisions." "I know that. You say that now." "I mean it now." He held her gaze. I told you I'd been asking around about you. What I didn't say is that I asked specifically how you handled it when people pushed back on your decisions. On the feed arrangement, on the pasture lease. What happened when the men you were dealing with decided they didn't particularly want to deal with a woman? She was quiet. Lars Kellerman said you sat across the table from him for 45 minutes while he tried every angle he had to get you to take less than you'd asked for, Caleb said. And you didn't move. He said it was the most expensive cup of coffee he'd ever had. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. That's what I need, not someone who'll soften when it gets uncomfortable. I'm not soft, she said. I know. But I want to be clear, she said, that being hard isn't all I am. I'm not just a useful tool for your operation. I'm not asking you to be. She studied him. The problem with this man was that he seemed to mean what he said, and she had no reliable way of verifying whether that was true yet or whether it would still be true 6 months from now when the novelty of her competence had worn off and the friction of an actual shared life had set in. I want to meet your father, she said. Something crossed his face. He's not well. I understand that. I still want to meet him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, and she followed him up the stairs. Gideon Voss was smaller than she'd imagined him. The men who build empires tend to take on a certain mythology, and the mythology around Gideon was considerable. A hard man, a relentless man, someone who had looked at this raw Montana territory in 1851 and decided it was going to be his whether it agreed or not. What she saw in the upstairs room was an old man in a narrow bed, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent their last reserves of energy on something other than appearing well. He looked at her when she came in. His eyes were still sharp. That, at least, hadn't gone yet. You're the ward girl, he said. His voice was rough, like a hinge that needed oil. Liza Ward, she said. She didn't add anything polite to it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Sit down, he said to both of them, though there was only one chair. Caleb got another from the hallway without being asked. They sat. You know what you're walking into, the old man said. It wasn't a question. I'm beginning to, she said. My son's a better man than I was, Gideon said, flatly, without apparent emotion. I'm saying that because it's true, and because I spent too long not saying things that were true. He shifted slightly in the bed. I did things building this operation that I'm not proud of. Some of them will come back around. Probably already have started. The Maynard dispute, she said. His eyes sharpened further, among others. He told me there were real grievances. Gideon looked at Caleb. You said that. I said that, Caleb confirmed. The old man was quiet for a moment. Good, he said finally, just that. She walked out of that room with a clearer picture of what she was considering than she'd had walking in. Not a simpler picture, clearer. There was a difference. She spent 2 nights on the Voss property before going back to her family's ranch. In that time she ate supper with Caleb and the foreman, a laconic, competent man named Walt Briggs, who assessed her in the first 5 minutes and then treated her like a person, which she appreciated. And she read through more of the operational paperwork, and she walked the east boundary line where the Maynard dispute centered. When Caleb drove her back to the Ward Ranch on the 3rd morning, she said, I'll do it, with the understanding that everything I told you at the kitchen table holds. It holds, he said, and I want it known from the beginning, to your men, to your business partners, to whoever else needs to know, that I'm not there as decoration. If that's a problem for people, I'd rather know now than find out later. It'll be a problem for some people, he said honestly. This part of Montana in 1884 doesn't have a lot of patience for women who make operational decisions. I've been making operational decisions in this part of Montana for 4 years, she said. I have some experience with the impatience. He looked sideways at her. Yeah, he said. I expect you do. They were married 3 weeks later in a brief civil ceremony with a justice of the peace and 4 witnesses, none of whom were from her family. Her mother sent a letter that was warm in its way but careful, as if she was still deciding how to feel about the whole thing. Her father sent a note in his cramped handwriting that said he was proud of her, which was the first time she could remember him using that specific phrase in direct reference to her, and she put the note in her coat pocket and didn't take it out for several days. Rosalie sent nothing. The first morning she woke up in the Voss house as its co-owner, she lay still in the unfamiliar room and did a careful accounting of what she felt. Not what she was supposed to feel, what she actually felt. What she felt was alert, cautious, something that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. And underneath all of that, a layer of something harder. The knowledge that she had walked into a situation with real complexity and real enemies and real stakes, and that the novelty of being chosen was not going to protect her from any of it. She got up before light, same as always. The kitchen was cold. She built the fire and put water on and stood at the window while it heated, looking out at the dark shape of the operation she had just married into. Somewhere out there in the black before dawn were 22 men who had their own opinions about the woman who had just arrived. She'd felt it in the 2 days she'd visited, the careful watchfulness of men who hadn't decided yet, the one or two who hadn't bothered being careful about it. Walt Briggs came in at 6, same as apparently he always did, and stopped short when he saw her at the stove. "Mrs. Voss," he said, in a tone that was neutral in the deliberate way that means a person is working at it. "Coffee's almost ready," she said. "Walt, I want to talk to you about the schedule." He sat down slowly. The schedule. The feed delivery coming Thursday. There's a discrepancy in the invoice from the last order that I want to have resolved before we accept the next one. Also, the boundary line on the east pasture. I want to walk it with you before the end of the week. He was quiet for a moment. "Those are things Mr. Voss handles." "Mr. Voss and I handle them together," she said, and poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him. "I'd appreciate your help." He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. He was a man in his mid-50s with 30 years of range experience and the particular pride of a foreman who has done his job well and knows it, and she watched him work through all of that in about 8 seconds. "The east boundary," he said. "You'll want to know about the creek markers. They've moved twice since the original survey." "I'll want to know everything," she said. He picked up his coffee. "All right then," he said. "Not warm, not unfriendly, just open." The door slightly left ajar. She sat down across from him with her own cup, and they talked through the week's work while the light came up gray and slow outside, and the rest of the house woke around them, and the operation she had married into began another day without knowing yet what had just walked through its door. The trouble, when it started, was quieter than she'd expected. It didn't come with shouting or confrontation. It came the way most real trouble comes. Sideways, and from a direction you were watching but not quite watching closely enough. A hand named Garth Pell had been on the Voss operation for 7 years. He was good with cattle and difficult with people, the kind of man whose competence makes everyone around him reluctant to address his behavior. He said nothing directly to Eliza in the first week. He simply made a point of not looking at her when she spoke, of addressing his questions to Walt or to Caleb even when she was standing right there and had already begun answering. She let it go for 4 days because she was learning the landscape, and because picking fights before you understand the terrain is a good way to lose them. On the 5th day, she was going over the hay inventory in the supply barn, and Pell came in with 2 other hands, and she heard him say, low and easy, to the man beside him, "Don't see why we need to clear it with her. She's been here a week." She didn't look up from the ledger. "Pell," she said. He stopped. "The hay order that went in last month. There are 40 bales unaccounted for in the tally. You want to tell me where they went, or should I ask someone else?" The silence in the barn was the specific kind that happens when everyone present is very carefully not looking at each other. He said, "I don't report to you." She closed the ledger. She turned around. He was a big man, taller than her by 4 inches and broader, and he had the kind of face that had gotten used to things going its preferred way. 40 bales is not a small discrepancy," she said. "And you've been running the supply chain on this side of the property for 2 years. So either you know where they went, or there's a problem with the accounting that reflects on you. Which is it?" He stared at her. She looked back at him with the particular patience of a woman who has had this exact argument in different forms her entire life and is no longer afraid of the silence that comes before a man decides whether to back down. He backed down. Not gracefully. There was a damaged section in the east storage. Bales were moved to the Kellerman lease before I knew we were pulling that arrangement. "Before the arrangement changed," she said. "Yes." "So they're still there." Should be. I'll need a count by Friday, she said. In writing. He left. The two men with him left without looking at her. She turned back to the ledger and kept working, and did not let herself feel the shaking in her hands until she was alone. That evening, Caleb said, "Walt told me about Pell. Walt talks fast. Walt's loyal, and he wanted me to know." He was quiet a moment. "How'd it go?" "He'll be a problem for a while," she said, "but not a permanent one." Caleb nodded. He didn't offer to handle it for her. She noticed that. She noticed it the way you notice something you'd been bracing against that turns out not to happen, with a relief that had some surprise in it. "Gideon's worse today," he said after a moment. She looked at him then. Actually looked at him, not at the problem they were managing, but at the man sitting across from her who was watching his father run out of time and carrying the weight of an inherited empire and trying against what seemed like considerable odds to be different from what he'd been taught. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded, looked at his hands. "He asked about you." "What did he say?" "He said—" Caleb stopped, worked at it for a moment. "He said he thinks you might be what this place has needed, but that he hopes you know what you've gotten yourself into." She looked out the dark window at the black Montana night. "I know," she said. She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she was beginning to learn the shape of it, piece by piece, in the cold early mornings and the difficult silences and the small battles that nobody outside these walls would ever know about. And that, she thought, was how all real things started, not with certainty, but with the willingness to keep finding out. Gideon Voss died on the 14th of December, 3 weeks after the first real snow, in the same room where he'd slept for 30 years. Caleb was there. Eliza was there too, sitting in the chair by the window, because Caleb had asked her to stay, and she had stayed, and she watched him hold his father's hand through the last hour without saying anything, because there was nothing to say that would make that particular thing easier. Afterward, Caleb sat in the kitchen for a long time without moving. Eliza made coffee and put a cup in front of him and sat across the table and let the silence be what it was. She didn't try to fill it. She'd learned early that some silences aren't problems to solve. He said, eventually, "He told me something last week, something I didn't know." She waited. "The Maynard land, the section that's been in dispute. My father didn't just push the boundary markers. He paid the original surveyor to file false measurements." He looked at his hands around the cup. "Cole Maynard's father bought that land in good faith in 1869. When he figured out what had happened, my father threatened his financing, forced him to sell 2 sections at below value just to keep the rest." He paused. "Cole Maynard isn't pursuing a legal dispute. He's pursuing what he's owed." The fire in the stove ticked and settled. "How much of what you have came from that?" she asked. "I don't know yet. I need to go through everything." He finally looked up at her. "I wanted you to know before anyone else did." She understood what he was doing. He was telling her she could leave, not with those words, but with that one. He was giving her the information and the space to make a different decision than the one she'd already made. She said, "Then we'll go through everything." He looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find enough of it. He nodded once and picked up his coffee, and they sat there together in the long Montana dark while his father cooled upstairs, and the operation around them breathed and shifted the way large things do when the hand that built them finally lets go. They buried Gideon in the frozen ground on a gray Thursday morning with 12 people present. Cole Maynard was not among them, but Eliza noticed a rider on the ridge above the property during the burial, still watching, and she filed that away. The trouble she'd been tracking in the weeks since her arrival now moved faster, the way things do when the constraint holding them in place is removed. Within 10 days of Gideon's death, 2 of the business arrangements that had been running on the old man's personal relationships began to show cracks. A beef buyer named Harlan Deeds sent a letter that was polite on its surface and threatening underneath, suggesting he'd need to renegotiate terms given the change in ownership. A neighboring rancher who had a water-sharing arrangement on the South Creek stopped showing up for the maintenance work that the arrangement required, which meant the work fell entirely on Voss' hands, and Cole Maynard sent a rider with a letter of his own. Eliza read it at the kitchen table while Caleb was out checking the south pasture fencing. The letter was not long. Maynard wrote the way a man writes when he has spent years thinking about exactly what he wants to say and has finally decided the time is right to say it. He laid out the history of the boundary dispute clearly, without excessive emotion, and at the end he said that with Gideon Voss in the ground, he expected the new ownership to account for what the Voss operation had taken from his family, and that he would give them until the end of January to respond before he took the matter to a territorial court and made everything in the Voss records public. She was still sitting with the letter when Caleb came back. He read it standing up, still in his coat, and when he finished, he set it on the table and stood there with his jaw tight. "He'll do it," Caleb said. "He's not bluffing." "I know. If he takes it to court and those records go public, the surveyor payments, the forced sale, it won't just be a legal matter. It'll be every agreement we have, every relationship, every contract, all of it called into question at once." "I know that too," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. "What do you think?" She'd been thinking about it since she'd finished reading the letter 20 minutes ago. She'd been thinking about it, in a way, since Gideon told her in that upstairs room that his past would come back around. "I think Maynard is right," she said. "I think he's owed something real, and he knows it, and we know it, and trying to fight him legally is going to cost us more than giving him what's fair." Giving him what's fair could mean— "I know what it could mean," she said. "I've been going through the records with you for 3 weeks. I have a rough sense of what the real boundary line should be, and what the forced sale cost his family in the long run." She paused. "It's significant." "Yeah," he said. "It is. But trying to bury it is worse," she said. "That's the thing I keep coming back to. Your father buried it for 15 years, and all that happened is the debt got bigger." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up off the open land, the kind of wind that finds every gap in the walls and reminds you how thin the line is between inside and out in a Montana winter. "I want to go see him," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Maynard." "Yes. He sent a formal letter with a legal deadline." "I know, and I want to go see him in person before any of this goes any further. Not with lawyers, not with an offer prepared in advance, just to sit across from him and understand what we're actually dealing with." "He might not see you." "He might not," she agreed, "but I think he will. He's not a man who wants a war. He wants acknowledgement. There's a difference." Caleb studied her. She was aware of how it might look. 3 weeks on this property, still largely unknown to most of the people who mattered, and she was proposing to walk into the lion's den on behalf of an operation she hadn't built and didn't fully understand yet. "Let me come with you," he said. "No." She said it plainly, without softening it. "If you come, it becomes a negotiation between the two ranch owners. If I go alone, it's different. It's—" She thought about how to say it accurately. "It's me acknowledging that this isn't a situation where we're trying to win. It signals something different." He thought about that. "And if he throws you off his property, then I'll come home and we'll figure out another approach." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with that particular expression she'd seen a few times now say, not quite admiration, not quite frustration, something in between that she suspected he hadn't had much call to use before she arrived. "When do you want to go?" he said. "Tomorrow morning." Cole Maynard's ranch was 14 miles east, and Eliza drove herself in the small wagon because arriving alone mattered. The morning was clear and brutal cold, the kind of cold that makes everything sharp-edged and unforgiving, and she sat straight on the bench with her coat pulled close and thought through everything she knew and everything she didn't. She knew the facts of what Gideon had done. She knew the rough measure of what it had cost the Maynard family. She knew that Cole Maynard was in his late 40s, that he'd expanded what remained of his father's land into a respectable operation despite starting with less than he should have had, and that he was known as a careful and deliberate man. Not hot-tempered, not reckless. The kind of man who waits until he's certain before he moves. What she didn't know was what he actually wanted. Not the legal claim. The human thing underneath it. The Maynard spread was smaller than the Voss operation, but well-ordered in a way that told her things about the man who ran it. Nothing wasted, nothing showy. Every fence line she could see from the road was properly maintained. A hand came out when she pulled up and she told him her name and asked to see Cole Maynard. The hand went inside and she sat on the wagon bench and waited, which she was good at. Maynard came to the door himself. He was a lean, weathered man with a careful face and eyes that took in information without immediately broadcasting what they thought about it. He looked at her on the wagon bench, and then he looked at the wagon, and she knew he'd clocked that she'd come alone. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Mr. Maynard, thank you for coming out." "I haven't invited you in yet." "I know," she said. "I wanted to ask in person rather than assume." He stood there for a moment. Then he stepped back and held the door. His kitchen was plain and clean and warmer than it looked from outside. A woman appeared briefly in the hallway. His wife, Eliza guessed, a quiet, observant person who disappeared again without being introduced, though Eliza had the feeling she wasn't far. Maynard sat across from her at the table and didn't offer anything, which she didn't take personally. She hadn't come here to be made comfortable. "I read your letter," she said. "I assumed you had." "Everything in it is accurate," she said. "The surveyor, the forced sale, all of it. We've been going through Gideon's records. It's there." Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, but adjustment, the way a man adjusts when he's been braced for one kind of conversation and finds himself in another. "You're admitting it." "I'm saying what's true," she said. "I didn't do those things, and neither did Caleb. But we have what we have, partly because your family has less than it should. That's not something we can argue our way around." He was quiet for a moment. "Your husband sent you here to offer me something." "My husband didn't send me," she said. "I asked to come. He would have come himself, but I thought that wasn't the right approach." "Why?" "Because the thing I want to understand first, before any discussion of what comes next, is what this has cost your family. Not the acreage and not the dollar amount, the actual cost." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without flinching. "My father spent the last 8 years of his life believing he'd failed us," Maynard said, finally. His voice was even, but the evenness was the kind that takes effort. He bought that land legally, he built on it, and then piece by piece he had to watch it go, and he could never fully explain to my mother why it was happening because, to explain it, he'd have had to admit he couldn't fight it. He paused. He died thinking the loss was partly his fault. The kitchen was very quiet. "That's what it cost," he said. Eliza didn't say she was sorry, because sorry was too small and too easy, and she didn't think this man wanted small, easy things. She said, "That's what I needed to understand." "And what do you do with it?" "I bring it back to Caleb," she said, "and we figure out what an honest accounting looks like. Not what we can defend legally, but what's actually right." She paused. "I can't give your father back those years or fix what he carried. Nobody can do that. But the land question and the financial question, those can be addressed honestly if both sides are willing to come to the table without lawyers in the first round." He studied her. "You've been on the Voss property for what? A month. About that. And you're here making commitments on behalf of an operation you just walked into." "I'm not making commitments," she said carefully. "I'm asking if you're willing to talk. Before the court and the public records. Just talk." He was quiet long enough that she could hear the wind against the window. His wife appeared in the doorway again, this time with 2 cups of coffee, and set them on the table and left without a word. And the gesture told Eliza something about the marriage and about the woman, and she filed all of it away. Maynard picked up his cup. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. He said, "My father's name was Robert." "I know," she said. "It's in the records." He nodded, slowly, like he was deciding something that had nothing to do with boundary lines or dollar amounts. "I'll come to the Voss property," he said. "One conversation. No lawyers, no writers, just me. You and your husband on your side." "That's all I'm asking," she said. She drove home in the early afternoon through air so cold it hurt to breathe, and she felt the particular exhaustion of having held herself very still for a very long time. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that comes from the sustained effort of being careful when every instinct says to rush. Caleb was waiting on the porch when she pulled in. He came down and took the horse's bridle while she climbed down from the bench, and he looked at her face and said, "He'll come." "He'll come," she said. "How did you—" "I listened," she said. Mostly, I just listened. He stood there looking at her in the flat winter light, and she could see him working through what that meant. What it meant that she'd gone into that situation alone and come back with something that 3 weeks of legal positioning had failed to produce. There's something else, she said. He waited. Garth Pell. She'd been sitting with this on the drive back. He knew about the surveyor, not everything, but enough. He's been on this property 7 years, and Gideon trusted him with things he shouldn't have. I found a second set of delivery records last week that I think Pell has been using to skim from the supply chain, small amounts, consistently, for at least 2 years. I didn't say anything because I wanted to be sure. Caleb's expression went flat. Not angry, exactly. The thing before angry. How sure are you? Sure enough that I wrote it down and I want you to look at it tonight. He was quiet for a moment. That's 2 things in one day. I know. Maynard and Pell both in the same day. I didn't plan the timing, she said. That's just where we are. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed, short and real, and slightly exhausted, the laugh of a man who has just been reminded that the world does not pace itself to what's convenient. Come inside, he said. It's too cold to stand here being astonished. She followed him in. Walt Briggs was in the kitchen when they entered, and he looked at Eliza with the particular expression she'd been seeing from him lately. The look of a man who has revised his estimate of someone upward and is still adjusting to the new number. Walt, she said, pulling off her coat. I need you to pull the supply records from the last 2 years, the copies in the East Barn storage, not the ones in the office. He glanced at Caleb. You heard her? Caleb said. Walt left without another word. She sat down at the table and spread out the notes she'd made on the drive back, while the details were still precise in her memory, and Caleb sat across from her and they started working through it the way they'd started working through everything, together, carefully, without pretending it was simpler than it was. Outside, the light was failing fast the way it did in December, the dark coming down early and complete. The operation around them kept running, horses fed, cattle checked, fires banked, the ordinary machinery of survival continuing regardless of what the people inside the house were carrying. Pell would have to go. The question was how to do it in a way that didn't expose what they'd found before they were ready to deal with the fallout, because the fallout from one dishonest hand was manageable. But the fallout from a dishonest hand combined with a public boundary dispute, combined with a grieving new owner who hadn't established his authority yet, was the kind of compounding trouble that destroyed operations. She said, We wait on Pell until after Maynard's visit. Caleb looked up from the records. If we move on Pell now, it creates noise at exactly the wrong time, she said. Maynard needs to see a steady operation when he comes. A house that's handling its business. If he arrives and there's internal chaos, hands fired, rumors running, it signals weakness. And if Pell does more damage in the meantime. I'll keep closer watch on the supply chain, she said. I've already moved the secondary records. He won't have access to what he's been using. She paused. It's a calculated risk, but I think it's the right call. He looked at her across the table, all those notes between them, the remains of the day's work, the cold dark outside, the dying fire in the stove that neither of them had gotten up to feed. When I went to your family's ranch, he said, I told your father I came looking for someone who could think through complexity without losing her head. I remember. I want you to know, he said carefully, like he was finding the right words and not in a hurry to use the wrong ones, that I did not fully understand what that was going to look like. She held his gaze. Is that a problem? No, he said, and then, quieter. It's the opposite of a problem. She looked back down at the records and did not say what she felt, which was something complicated and still forming that she didn't have the right language for yet. She was not a woman who trusted new things quickly. She had good reasons for that. But she was beginning to understand that what she had here was not what she'd expected when she'd stood at that cold fence line and shaken a stranger's hand. It was harder than she'd expected, and more dangerous, and considerably more real. She got up and fed the stove. Then she sat back down and they kept working. Cole Maynard came on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after Eliza's visit to his property, riding alone the way he'd said he would. No riders behind him, no lawyer, nothing that signaled he was coming for a fight. Just a man on a good horse in the cold January morning, arriving at the time he'd said he'd arrive. Eliza had the kitchen table cleared and coffee ready, and she stayed out of the main room while Caleb met him at the door, because some things need to start a certain way, and she understood that Maynard needed to see Caleb first, needed to look the son in the eye before anything else happened. She heard them come in, heard the low exchange of voices, careful and formal. Then Caleb said, "My wife would like to sit with us, if that's agreeable to you." A pause. Then Maynard's voice. "It's agreeable." She came in and the three of them sat at the table and she poured coffee, and nobody reached for pleasantries because none of them were there for pleasantries. Maynard looked older in the kitchen light than he had in his own. The cold ride had put some color in his face, but the lines around his eyes were deep, and she thought about what he'd said about his father believing the loss was his own fault, and she kept that in the front of her mind the way you keep a lantern close when you're working in the dark. Caleb spoke first. He laid it out plainly. What the records showed, what Gideon had done, what the forced sale had actually cost in land value based on what those acres were worth at honest market in 1869. He didn't minimize any of it, and he didn't editorialize. He just said what was true. Maynard listened without interrupting. His face didn't change much, but his hands around the coffee cup shifted once, tightening briefly when Caleb got to the part about the surveyor payment. Just once, then still again. When Caleb finished, Maynard said, "You've done the accounting." "My wife did the accounting," Caleb said. "I checked it." Maynard looked at Eliza. "How'd you arrive at the valuation?" "Land prices in this county from 1869 through 1875 averaged," she said. "Then I looked at what comparable sections sold for in the years after the forced sale, sections your family should still have owned during that period, and calculated lost revenue potential against what you actually had access to." She paused. "It's not a perfect number, it can't be, but it's an honest one." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people in your position would have come in with a lawyer and a lower number. Most people in our position would have more to hide," she said. "We're not trying to hide anything." He looked at the papers Caleb had set on the table. He didn't touch them yet. "What are you proposing?" Caleb said, "The eastern section, the one the original survey was falsified for. We're proposing to return it to you, properly surveyed, properly transferred, no payment, no conditions." Maynard's expression shifted. "Not by much." "That's 50 acres. "It was always yours," Eliza said. "The financial piece," Maynard said. "The revenue your family made off those acres while my family couldn't." "We can't pay it all at once," Caleb said. "I want to be straight about that. The operation is sound, but it's not so liquid we can write one check and clear it. What I'm proposing is a structured payment over 5 years, documented and legally binding, with interest." Maynard looked at the papers again. This time he reached out and picked up the top page. He read it slowly, the way a man reads something he wants to understand rather than something he wants to finish. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, one of the horses in the near paddock called out, and then went quiet. "You know what happens if this gets around," Maynard said, setting the page down. "People find out the Voss operation is paying out on its founder's dishonesty. There'll be others. People who've had dealings with Gideon over 30 years. Some of them legitimate grievances, some of them not. You'll have no way to tell the difference at first." "I know," Caleb said. "You're willing to take that risk." "We don't see it as a choice," Eliza said. "Not really." Maynard looked at her, then at Caleb, then back at the papers. He sat with it for long enough that Eliza had time to become aware of her own heartbeat again, that particular awareness that came when something important was being decided and she couldn't control the outcome. "I want one more thing," Maynard said. "Tell me," Caleb said. "My father's name. Robert Maynard." He said it the way he'd said it to Eliza at his kitchen table, deliberate, like each word had weight. "I want it acknowledged in the transfer document, not buried in legal language. I want it written plainly that this transfer is made in acknowledgement of the wrong done to Robert Maynard and his family." The room held that. Caleb said, "I'll write it myself." Maynard picked up his coffee for the first time since he'd sat down. He drank some of it. He looked out the kitchen window at the gray January sky, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself for a moment. Then he said, "All right." That was all. No handshake yet, no formal language. Just those two words in a quiet kitchen, and Eliza felt something in her chest release that had been wound tight since December. They spent another 2 hours going through the specifics. It was careful, detailed work, and there were 2 points where the numbers created friction, and she had to hold the line on what was fair against what was comfortable. And Maynard pushed back once in a way that was reasonable, and she acknowledged it and adjusted, and he nodded, and that was how real negotiation worked. Not one side winning, but both sides arriving somewhere neither of them had started. When Maynard left, he shook Caleb's hand on the porch, and then he looked at Eliza and said, "You came to my house alone." "I did," she said. "My wife thought that was either very brave or very foolish." "Probably some of both," Eliza said. Something that might have been the beginning of respect settled into his expression. Or maybe it had been there since the kitchen table and she was only now able to see it clearly. He nodded at her once, mounted his horse, and rode back the way he'd come. Caleb stood beside her on the porch until Maynard was out of sight. Then he said quietly, "Okay." "Okay," she said. They went back inside. There was still a great deal of work to do. The Pell matter came to a head 5 days later, which was not quite when she'd planned for it, but close enough. She'd been monitoring the supply chain carefully since she'd moved the secondary records, and what she'd found in the last 2 weeks had clarified the picture considerably. Pell had been systematic about it, not dramatic, not greedy in a way that would draw attention quickly. Small amounts, consistently, rotated across different line items so that no single entry looked obviously wrong. It was the kind of theft that required patience and a reasonable understanding of how ledgers worked, and she had to give him a grim credit for the sophistication of it before she set that aside and focused on what to do. She had everything documented: amounts, dates, the pattern. She'd shown it to Walt the night before, and Walt had gone very still and then very quietly furious in the contained way of a man who takes his professional integrity personally. 7 years, Walt said. "At least 2 years of this that I can trace," she said, "possibly longer." "He vouched for my supply numbers," Walt said. "When Caleb asked me about the hay discrepancy last fall, the one you flagged, Pell vouched for my records." He stopped. "He was covering himself by covering me." "I know," she said. "I want you to know that none of this touches you. The documentation makes that clear." Walt was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" "Be there when I talk to him," she said, "as witness. I don't want to do this without a witness." She found Pell in the equipment barn the next morning, which was early enough that most of the other hands weren't around yet. Walt came in behind her and stood near the door. Pell looked up from the harness he'd been working on and saw her face and the particular quality of the silence that had come in with her and Walt, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not guilt, exactly. More like calculation. The rapid reassessment of a man who realizes the ground has changed. "Morning," he said carefully. "I need to talk to you about the supply records," Eliza said. She set the folder she was carrying on the workbench beside him. Specifically, the pattern I found when I cross-referenced the delivery logs against the storage inventories for the last 2 years. He didn't look at the folder. He looked at her. "I don't know what you think you found." "I don't think anything," she said. "I know what the numbers show. So do you." "You've been here 2 months," he said. His voice had shifted. Not loud, but the control in it had a new edge. "You walk in here and start pulling through records that go back before you—" "Before I what?" she said. "Before I had any business looking at them?" She kept her voice even. "I'm the co-owner of this operation, and I am looking at every record in it. That's not something I need your permission for." He glanced at Walt. Walt looked back at him with the particular expression of a man who has made his decision and is not going to be moved from it. Pell looked back at her. The calculation in his eyes shifted again, moving through options, coming up short. "What happens now?" he said. "You're done here," she said. "Today. I'll give you until noon to collect your gear." She paused. "What I'm not going to do is take this to the sheriff, because doing that publicly right now creates problems for this operation that go beyond what you've cost us. But I want to be clear that I have everything documented, And if anything comes back, if there's anything else we find once you're gone, that changes." He stared at her for a long moment. She could see him weighing whether to argue, whether to make it ugly, whether 7 years on this property gave him any leverage worth using. It didn't, and he knew it. "Fine," he said. It came out rough, like something dragged over gravel. "Walt will be nearby until you leave," she said. She picked up the folder and walked out of the barn, and she kept her pace steady and her back straight until she was far enough away that neither of them could see her hands. Walt came to the house at noon. "He's gone," he said. "Thank you," she said. He stood there for a moment in the doorway, turning his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it straight." "Go ahead." "When you first got here, I wasn't sure about you," he said. "Not because of anything you'd done. Just because things were already complicated, and another complicated thing didn't seem welcome." "I understood that," she said. "I know you did." He looked at the hat in his hands. "I've been running the operational side of this place for 11 years. I've seen what happens when the wrong people come in and try to manage something they don't understand." He paused. "You understand it. I don't know how, given the time, but you do." He looked up. "I wanted you to know I see that." She held his gaze. Coming from Walt Briggs, this was roughly equivalent to a speech. "I appreciate that," she said. "I mean it." He put his hat back on and went back to work. The letter from her mother arrived the following week. It was longer than usual, and her mother's careful social handwriting had a slightly different quality in it, less arranged, more honest. She wrote about the Ward Ranch, which was struggling as it always had, but managing as it always had, and about Eliza's father, who had started sleeping later and whose cough had gotten worse in the cold months. She wrote about Rosalie briefly, in a way that told Eliza her mother was choosing words with particular care, that Rosalie had been keeping company with a merchant's son in town, that things seemed to be progressing in that direction. And then, at the bottom of the page, almost like she'd almost not written it, her mother wrote, "I think about the afternoon Mr. Voss came, and I find myself thinking I did not give you the credit you were due, for a long time before that day, and perhaps longer. I'm not good at saying this directly. I'm trying to do better at it." Eliza read that paragraph 3 times. Then she folded the letter and put it in the drawer where she kept things she wanted to keep. She wrote back that evening. She kept it factual for most of the page. What the operation looked like, what they'd resolved with Maynard, how the winter was sitting on the land. At the end she wrote, "I know it wasn't simple for you either. I never thought it was." She stopped there and considered adding more, and then decided that was enough for now. Some things took time to say fully, and she and her mother had time. The Maynard transfer was completed in the 3rd week of January, drawn up by a lawyer from the county seat who kept his expression neutral throughout the proceeding in the way of a man who has seen enough unusual arrangements to stop being surprised by them. The document named Robert Maynard plainly, as agreed, in language that Caleb had written himself and read aloud before signing. Maynard signed without ceremony. When it was done, he sat there for a moment looking at the signed papers, and then he said, to no one in particular, "My father would have liked to see this." Nobody answered that. Some things don't need answering. What happened after the transfer was both more and less than Eliza had expected. Maynard had been right that word would get around. Within a month, 2 other men from the county sent letters to the Voss operation with their own claims about dealings with Gideon. One legitimate, one not, and she had to spend considerable time with the records to establish which was which. The legitimate one they addressed honestly. The other she pushed back on with documentation calmly and specifically, and it went away. The Harlan Deeds situation resolved itself more awkwardly. Deeds came to renegotiate the beef contract in February, as his letter had threatened, and he came with the confident energy of a man who expects the changed ownership to mean a weaker position. Eliza sat in on that meeting, which she'd told Caleb she would do beforehand, and Deeds spent the first 15 minutes of the negotiation directing everything at Caleb and looking past her as if she were furniture. She let it go for 15 minutes. Then she said, "Mr. Deeds, the current contract has a volume guarantee that I think you'll find is actually favorable to your position going forward, given the winter cattle numbers. Before you propose new terms, it might be worth looking at what you'd be giving up." Deeds looked at her for the first time, looked at Caleb, looked back at her. Your wife negotiates your contracts, he said flatly. My wife understands this operation better than most, Caleb said. So yes. Deeds renegotiated. The terms he ended up with were marginally less favorable to him than what he'd come in demanding. He knew it, and she suspected he'd be turning it over in his head for a while, but he signed because the alternative was losing a supply relationship that worked for him too. After he left, Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, and then at her. You enjoyed that, he said. I didn't enjoy it, she said, but I wasn't sorry about it. He laughed. The real kind, not polite. She'd been learning the difference. In March, a woman named Clara Briggs, Walt's wife, who lived in town and came out to the property twice a month, appeared at the kitchen door with a pie and an expression of cautious friendliness that Eliza recognized as the kind of social approach that requires significant personal effort. She'd had few women try to be friendly to her in her life because she knew she wasn't easy and had never particularly tried to be. She wasn't soft. She wasn't charming. She was direct in ways that made some people uncomfortable. But Clara Briggs was not soft either, as it turned out. She was a practical, plain-speaking woman who sat down at the kitchen table and ate pie with Eliza and talked about the county the way someone talks when they actually know it, and Eliza found herself listening with more interest than she'd expected. People are talking about you, Clara said without preamble. I imagine they are, Eliza said. Some of it's not kind. I didn't expect it to be. Clara looked at her. Some of it is, though. More than I'd have predicted a few months ago. She paused. The Maynard thing got around. Robert Maynard was known. What happened to his family was known, even if nobody said it out loud while Gideon was alive. She cut another small piece of pie with the side of her fork. When word got out that the new Mrs. Voss had gone over there alone and worked something out, people noticed. Eliza was quiet for a moment. I didn't do it to be noticed. I know that, Clara said. That's exactly why people noticed. The spring came slowly, the way Montana springs do. Reluctantly, in fits, with cold snapping back every few days, as if the winter hadn't entirely decided to leave yet. The operation expanded back out from its winter configuration, more hands-on, more movement, more of the complicated daily machinery of running something this size fully operational. Eliza had been on the Voss property for 5 months. She knew its rhythms now, its particular problems, the places where it was strong, and the places where it had been allowed to get sloppy under Gideon's later years when his energy had gone into defending what he had, instead of maintaining it. She had opinions about all of it, and she'd learned which ones to voice and when, and which ones to sit with until the timing was right. She was not comfortable. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. This was not a life that had settled into ease. There were days when the accumulated weight of managing things that didn't want to be managed pressed down on her in a way that made her stand at the kitchen window in the early morning and breathe carefully and remind herself why she'd made the choices she'd made. There were also days when Caleb came in from the range in the early evening and sat across from her at the table, and they talked through whatever needed talking through, and there was something in those conversations that was not complicated, something direct and practical and increasingly unguarded on both sides that she had no clean word for yet. One evening in late March, he said, Your father wrote me. She looked up from the ledger. My father. Last week. He reached into his coat pocket and put the letter on the table between them. I didn't know what to do with it, so I didn't say anything right away. She looked at the letter without touching it, her father's cramped handwriting on the envelope. What does he say? He thanks me, Caleb said, his voice careful. For choosing you, is how he puts it. And then he says, he stopped. You should read it. She picked it up. Her father's handwriting was harder to read than usual, like the pen had been unsteady. He thanked Caleb in the formal way of a man writing to another man, and then near the end he'd written something that clearly cost him. I should have said years ago what I'm saying now. She was always the one holding things together. I let her do it without telling her what it meant. A man doesn't always know what he has until he watches it leave, and by then the time for saying things properly has mostly passed. But I'm saying it now, in case it counts for something. She set the letter down. She looked at the far wall for a moment. It counts for something, she said. Caleb nodded. He didn't push on it. He picked up his own work, and they sat there in the warm kitchen while the spring dark settled outside. Two imperfect people doing their best with what they'd inherited and what they'd built, and what they were still, slowly, figuring out about each other. The knock at the door came at 8:30, which was late enough to be unusual. She went to answer it because Caleb was in the back of the house, and she opened it to find a young hand from the Southern pasture crew, hat in hand, looking like he'd ridden hard. "There's a fire," he said. "South Hay Storage. It's already going." She had her coat on before he finished the sentence. The South Hay Storage was a long, low structure that held the bulk of the winter reserve they hadn't yet moved to the feeding rotation, and by the time Eliza got there it was already serious. Not catastrophic yet. The fire had started at the east end and the wind was mercifully light, but serious enough that the men who'd gotten there first were standing at a frustrated distance because nobody had thought to organize a water line. She didn't stop moving when she assessed it. "Walt!" she called, and Walt was there, emerging from the group of hands who'd gathered at the edge of the firelight. "Water line from the north trough. 2 men on the pump, rest of you in a chain. Move the hay bales on the west end out first. Anything we can save on that side, save it." "The east end's already—" "I know the east end is gone," she said. "Work the west." They moved. People move when someone gives a clear direction in a crisis. That was one of the things she'd learned early, and it still surprised her a little. How much of managing a bad situation was just being the person willing to say the next thing out loud. Caleb arrived at a run 2 minutes later, having come from the back of the house where he hadn't heard the knock. He took in the fire, and the organized chain of men, and Walt directing the water, and Eliza standing at the operational edge of it, and he came to stand beside her. "How bad?" he said. "East third is lost. Maybe half. If the wind doesn't pick up, we'll save the west portion." She kept her eyes on the line of men. "I need you on the far side. There's a gap in the chain near the corner post. Someone needs to anchor it." He went without asking further questions, which she had come to understand was one of his better qualities. It took 2 hours to bring it fully under control. By the end, 11 men were soaked and smoke-darkened and running on the hollow energy of a crisis past, and they'd saved roughly a third of what the structure had held when the night started. The east end was a ruin of charred timber and ash. The smell of it would be in the air for days. When it was done and the men were heading back and Walt was doing a final check of the perimeter, Eliza stood at the edge of the burn zone and did the accounting in her head. A third saved, 2/3 lost. The remaining reserve in the north storage would cover the cattle through the rest of winter if they were careful, but there was no margin for a hard April, and April in Montana was not known for its generosity. Caleb came to stand beside her. He was smoke-darkened too, and there was a long scrape on the back of his left hand where he'd caught it on something in the dark. "How are we on feed?" he said. "Tight," she said. "Not desperate, but tight. I need to look at the north storage numbers in the morning and figure out what we can adjust." She paused. "We may need to lease additional grazing earlier than planned." "Kellerman." "Possibly. Or Maynard, if he has the capacity." She said it without thinking, and then registered what she'd said, and Caleb registered it too. That Maynard was now someone they could ask for something, because they'd handled things honestly, and honesty sometimes made a thing possible that wasn't possible before. "I'll ride out tomorrow," Caleb said. "We'll ride out tomorrow," she said. He looked at her sideways. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, just the glow of coals in the ruined east end, casting a dim orange light on the torn ground. His face in that light was tired and a little raw, stripped of the particular composure he kept in operational situations. "You all right?" he said. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. What she felt was the residue of an adrenaline spike, plus the honest weight of 2 hours of crisis management on top of an already full day, plus the low grinding awareness that they'd just lost a significant amount of their winter feed, and the math on the other side of it was not comfortable. She felt tired in a way that went past physical. She felt briefly, and with a clarity she usually kept at arm's length, the sheer accumulated mass of everything she'd walked into and everything she'd been carrying since October. "I'm tired," she said. "I'll be fine in the morning." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They stood there for another minute in the cold dark, not touching, just present in the same space, and that was enough. The cause of the fire turned out to be a lamp left too close to loose straw in the east corner, knocked over by nothing more dramatic than a rat moving through the dark. No malice, no enemy, just the ordinary carelessness of a tired man at the end of a long day who didn't set the lamp down carefully enough. Walt traced it back to a hand named Pete Sorrell, who had been doing a late check and hadn't reported the lamp falling because he hadn't realized it had caught. Eliza talked to Pete Sorrell in the equipment barn the next afternoon. He was 20 years old and had been on the property since summer, and he looked like a man who had been awake for 36 hours waiting for the axe to fall. "Tell me what happened," she said. Not accusatory, just direct. He told her. The lamp, the straw, the way it had been too dark and he'd been too tired and he'd thought he'd imagined the flicker before he left. He'd been 3 steps out the door when he convinced himself he'd imagined it. "Why didn't you go back and check?" she said. "I don't know," he said. He stopped. "I don't know, I should have." She looked at him for a long moment. He was 20 years old, and he'd made a careless mistake that had cost them significantly, and he knew it and had been sitting with it for 36 hours. "You should have," she said. "When you're uncertain, you go back and check. Every time, regardless of how tired you are or how sure you think you are. That's not optional, not on an operation this size." "Yes, ma'am." "You're staying on," she said. He looked up, surprised. "You made a mistake," she said. "People make mistakes. What matters is what you do with it." She paused. "You'll do the East End cleanup detail. All of it. And when we rebuild that storage structure in the summer, you'll be on that crew, from the first post to the last nail, because I want you to know that building down to your bones so you remember what you almost cost us." She paused again. "And then you'll know it, and that'll be worth something." He nodded. His jaw was working, but he held himself together. "Go get some sleep," she said. "You're no use to anyone like this." Walt found her afterward and said nothing for a moment, just fell into step beside her as she walked toward the house. "That was—" he started. "Don't say generous," she said. "I was going to say smart," he said. She glanced at him. "Well, maybe both." The ride to Maynard's property the next day was cold and clear, the kind of March morning that almost argues for spring before the afternoon reminds you it's still winter. They rode together, she and Caleb, which felt different from the November wagon ride when she'd been going out to persuade a stranger. 5 months of hard work and hard decisions will change the weight of things. Maynard came out when he heard them, and his wife appeared in the doorway behind him, the quiet, observant woman Eliza had noticed on her first visit, whose name she'd since learned was Margaret. Margaret Maynard had the kind of face that had been watching things for a long time and had drawn its own conclusions. "We had a fire," Caleb said when they were in the kitchen. He laid it out the same way he'd laid out his father's wrongs, plainly, without dressing it up. "We're going to be short on hay through April if it runs hard. I'm asking if you have grazing capacity on the east section you'd rent us." Maynard looked at his wife briefly, then at Caleb, then at Eliza. "How many head?" They talked numbers. Maynard negotiated fairly, not charitably, but fairly, and what they arrived at was reasonable on both sides. When it was done, Maynard poured them each a glass of something stronger than coffee, which at 11 in the morning felt right given the circumstances. Margaret Maynard said from her chair by the window, "How did the fire start?" "Lamp and loose straw," Eliza said. "Nobody hurt." Nobody hurt. Margaret looked at her with that long, quiet look. "Cole said you came here the first time alone." "I did." "I told him either you were the bravest woman in the county or you didn't understand the situation." "I understood the situation," Eliza said. Margaret Maynard smiled. Small, genuine, the smile of a woman who doesn't give them away easily. "I figured," she said. April did run hard. 3 cold snaps and a late snow that sat on the ground for 11 days and tested every calculation Eliza had made about the remaining feed supply. She adjusted as she went, the way you adjust when the margin is thin, moving cattle between pastures, timing the feeding rotations down to the hour, calling in a favor from Lars Kellerman for an emergency hay delivery at a price that made her wince, but that she paid because the alternative was worse. There were days in that April when she was running on 4 hours of sleep and the particular kind of focus that comes when you cannot afford to lose track of anything. There were evenings when she sat at the kitchen table after supper, and Caleb would come in and set a cup of coffee in front of her without being asked, and she would drink it without looking up from whatever she was working through, and he would sit down and work on his own problems, and neither of them would say much, and that was fine. That was, she had realized somewhere in the course of these months, actually a form of something real. The absence of performance. The ability to be tired and imperfect, and still in the same room without either of them working to appear otherwise. She had not had that before. She hadn't known to look for it. May came, and with it the release that spring actually brings when it finally commits. The land turning, the work shifting from defensive to expansive, the operation spreading back out into its full range of complexity. New calves on the ground, fence lines to repair after the winter's damage, the planning for the East Storage rebuild. It was in May that the letter came from Garth Pell. She almost hadn't expected it. She'd thought about him occasionally since January, the particular kind of occasional that means you haven't forgotten, but you've made your peace with how you handled it. The letter was short and written in the hand of a man who'd been composing it for a while and still wasn't satisfied with it. He didn't admit to what he'd done, not directly. He said he'd found work in the next county and that things had gone different than he'd expected on the Voss property. Then, near the end, he wrote, "I know why you didn't take it to the sheriff. I'm not sure I deserve that. I've thought about it." She read it twice. Then she wrote back, a short letter, factual, without warmth, but without cruelty either. She said she hoped the new situation was working out. She said she'd kept the documentation and would keep it, but that as long as things stayed quiet, they could both leave it where it was. She said, "I'm not sure you deserved it either, but it was the right call for the operation, and I make decisions based on what's right for the operation. That's what I'm here for." She sealed the letter and mailed it, and didn't mention it to Caleb, because some things you handle and then you put down. The summer brought a visitor she hadn't expected. Rosalie came on a Wednesday afternoon in June, arriving in a hired wagon that suggested she'd come from town rather than from the family ranch, and she stood at the front door with the careful composure of a woman who has been rehearsing something. Eliza let her in without ceremony and put water on, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Rosalie looked around the house with eyes that were taking in a great deal and giving away very little. "You look well," Rosalie said finally. "I'm fine," Eliza said. "How's Mother?" "The same. Daddy's cough is better since the weather warmed." A pause. "James Colton asked me to marry him. The merchant's son. Mother's pleased." "Are you pleased?" Rosalie was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands on the table, hands that were still softer than Eliza's and always would be, and that was just the truth of the lives they'd lived. "I think so. He's a decent man. He doesn't make me feel like a problem to be solved." Eliza heard that carefully. "That's worth something," she said. "I know it." Rosalie looked up. There was something in her face that Eliza hadn't seen before, or maybe had seen and not recognized because she'd never been looking for it. Something tired and a little honest. "I said things to you in the barn that day." "You did," Eliza said. "I was angry." She paused. "I'd been told my whole life I was the one with the future, and then in one afternoon that was—" She stopped. "But that's not an explanation. I'm not saying it as an explanation." "I know," Eliza said. "I wanted to say I was sorry," Rosalie said. "For the things I said. For the years before that too, when I let them treat you the way they did without saying it wasn't right." She met Eliza's eyes. "I knew it wasn't right. I didn't say it." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, one of the hands was crossing the yard with a purpose, and the sound of the operation doing what it did continued around them like water around stones. Eliza thought about what to say and decided to say the true thing rather than the easy thing, because that was how she operated, and she wasn't going to stop now. "You were younger," she said. You grew up inside the same situation I did. You just got a different part of it. I'm not going to hold it against you forever. I don't have the energy for that, and I don't think it does either of us any good." Rosalie blinked. "It's not forgiveness with a bow on it," Eliza said. "It's just where I am. We were both dealt something we didn't fully choose, and we both made the best of it we could with what we had." She paused. "You're going to marry a man who doesn't make you feel like a problem. That's a good start. Build on it. Rosalie looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in her face. Not the performative prettiness that had always been her armor, but something underneath it, something more real and more tired and more worth knowing. You always were the smart one, she said. Not bitterly, as if she was just now letting herself say it plainly. I was the one who had to be, Eliza said. They drank their tea. They talked, carefully at first, then with less effort, about the family ranch, about their parents, about what Rosalie's life in town was shaping up to look like. When Rosalie left 2 hours later, she hugged Eliza at the door, which they had not done since they were small children, and Eliza let herself be hugged and held on for a moment before letting go. She stood on the porch and watched the wagon until it rounded the far bend, and then she went back inside. Caleb was in the kitchen when she came in, earlier than she'd expected. He looked at her face. How'd it go? Better than I thought, she said. Worse than nothing. She considered that for a moment. About right, for what it was. He nodded. He understood inexact accounting. The East Storage rebuild started in June and was finished by mid-July. Pete Sorrell on the crew as promised, from the first post to the last nail. On the final day, when the structure was complete and the smell of new timber was strong in the summer air, Eliza walked through it alone before the hay went in. She ran her hand along one of the new beams, solid and straight, and thought about what it meant to build a thing correctly after it had burned. There was a lesson in that, though she was not the kind of person who said lessons out loud. She thought it anyway, that destruction wasn't the end of something unless you let it be, that sometimes what burned down was giving you the chance to build it better, if you had the sense and the will to take that chance rather than just mourn what was lost. She'd been given a life she hadn't planned and hadn't wanted and hadn't been sure she could manage. She had managed it, not cleanly, not without cost, not without days when she'd stood at the kitchen window in the early dark and wondered what exactly she'd gotten herself into and whether she was equal to it. Those days had not stopped entirely. She didn't expect them to, but she was equal to it. She'd learned that, not in one moment of revelation, but in the accumulated evidence of 100 small decisions made correctly under pressure, 100 situations handled and problems solved and difficult conversations had without flinching. Walt came and found her in the storage building and said, "You might want to come see this." She followed him outside. The hands were gathered in the yard, not in the formal, directed way of men waiting for instruction, but loosely, the way people gather when something is happening that they want to be near. Caleb was there, and Cole Maynard, which surprised her. She hadn't known Maynard was coming. He'd ridden over, apparently, to see the new structure finished, a gesture that meant more in this part of Montana than it would have anywhere with easier customs. A couple of the hands had brought out a jug of something, the way ranch hands do when there's a reason to mark an occasion, and it was passing around. When she came out of the building, Walt said, loudly enough for all of them to hear, "There she is." It wasn't a speech. Nobody made a speech. These were not men who made speeches. But there was something in the way they looked at her when Walt said it, something in the collective attention that carried its own weight, its own acknowledgement of things that didn't need to be spelled out. Maynard caught her eye and nodded, once. She nodded back. Caleb came to stand beside her. He didn't put his arm around her for the benefit of the audience. He just stood there, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and that was its own kind of statement. She accepted the jug when it came around and drank from it, something rough and strong that made her eyes water briefly, and passed it on. Later that evening, after Maynard had gone home and the hands had dispersed, and the summer dark was coming in slow and purple over the land, she and Caleb sat on the porch steps the way they sometimes did when the day's work was done and neither of them was ready to go inside yet. He said, 8 months. About that. You ever think about how it looked from the outside when you agreed to this? She considered the question. I thought about how it looked from the inside, she said. From the outside, it probably looked like a woman taking the only offer she was going to get. Is that what it was? No, she said, but I didn't know that yet. She paused. I knew you were serious. I knew the situation was real. I figured that was enough to start with. He was quiet for a moment. The land was going dark around them, the far hills turning to shapes against the sky. My father was a man who took what he wanted and told himself it was deserved, he said. I spent a long time being afraid I was going to turn into him without noticing. You're not him, she said. I know that better than I did a year ago, he said. Partly because of what we did with Maynard, partly because… He stopped, found the words. You don't let things slide. You don't let me let things slide. That's not comfortable, but it's good for a man. She looked at him sideways. I'm not here to be your conscience. I know. That's what makes it work. He looked back at the darkening land. You're here because you chose to be. That's different. She had chosen it. That was true. Not out of desperation, not out of the absence of other options. She'd had other options, smaller and safer ones, and she'd walked past them. She'd chosen the hardest version of a life because the hardest version was the one with the most real in it, and real was what she'd always been built for, even when everyone around her was pretending otherwise. She was not the daughter nobody wanted anymore. She wasn't sure she'd ever been, entirely. She'd been the daughter nobody bothered to look at properly, which was a different thing. The wanting had always been contingent on whether anyone was paying attention. She had paid attention to herself. In the end, that had been enough to start with. There were things still unresolved. There always were. The Voss name carried old weight in this county and would for years. There would be more claims, more letters, more situations where the price of Gideon's choices came due in ways they couldn't entirely predict. The operation was sound, but it was not simple, and it would never be simple. Walt would retire someday, and they'd have to find someone she trusted as much, which was not a small task. The relationship with her family was repaired in the way that damaged things repair. Not back to what they were, but into something different that worked differently, with more honesty and less assumption. Her father had sent a letter in the spring that said simply, I'm proud of what you've become. She'd written back, I was always this. You just couldn't see it from where you were standing. She hadn't said it meanly. She'd said it because it was true, and because she was done being the person who softened true things to make them easier for other people to hear. She was 47 years old inside, had been 47 years old inside since she was 19 probably, and she was done apologizing for the age of her understanding. The stars were coming out over the Montana hills, the particular dense scatter of them you only get away from any town, and she sat on the porch steps of the ranch she co-owned and looked at them and felt something that she might have called contentment if that word wasn't too quiet for it. It was more than contentment. It was the feeling of a life that had found its right size. Not a perfect life, not an easy one, but one that fit her, that called on all of her and used all of her, and didn't ask her to be smaller or quieter or more decorative than she was. She had never needed to be saved. She had needed to be seen. And in the end, she had gone out and made herself visible to the one person who had eyes open enough to look. Caleb said, You're thinking something. I'm always thinking something. You've got the particular quiet that means it's something worth saying. She looked at the stars for another moment. Then she said, I think we're going to be all right. Not fine, not easy. All right, which in her vocabulary was the highest honest praise for a life still in progress, still difficult, still demanding the best of the people living it. He said, Yeah. And then after a pause, I think so too. They sat there while the dark settled in fully around them, and the operation breathed and rested in the summer night, and the land that had been taken and partially returned and slowly rebuilt into something more honest than it started lay quiet under the stars. The woman who had been invisible for 26 years was not invisible anymore. She had not become visible by becoming something different. She had become visible by refusing, finally and completely, to keep standing in the dark. That was the thing worth knowing, not that the right person will find you if you wait long enough. That was a comfortable story, but not a reliable one. The thing worth knowing was this, that the life you're capable of living will not come looking for you. You have to walk out to the fence line and pick up the tools and start working, visible and real and unashamed of what you are, and trust that what's true about you will eventually be legible to the people who matter. Eliza Ward Voss had always been exactly who she needed to be. She had simply finally found a life large enough to hold her,